Our final talk this morning, it's Sam Shute from Quantum Security, and he's going to talk to us about XXE and why it's in the OWASP top 10. Thank you, Sam.
So I'm Sam, and I'm here to talk to you about XXE. So I guess just a little bit about me to kick things off. I started as a penetration tester at Quantum a little while ago now. I'm currently a principal consultant at Quantum, which means I do more meetings and less hacking. I like to do physical security, network pen testing, 3D printing and electronics. Those are usually the things that I'll talk about at conferences, so this is slightly different to what I normally talk about. So what we're talking about today is XXE, so XML External Entities, which is exploiting a specific feature within the XML specification, surprisingly called external entities. This can have a lot of consequences down the road for your application. You can cause things like a denial of service, you can read arbitrary files, and if the conditions are just right, you can end up getting remote code execution. So XML is, if anyone doesn't know what XML is, extensible markup language. It's a data encoding format. It's quite often used for passing data back and forwards very often between server to server, or applications like RSS feeds and things like that. Can you guys hear me okay now? Sweet. So XML, when it's passed back and forwards, is usually referred to as a document, and XML documents are made up of things called elements. And elements can have references to entities, which we'll cover a little bit more later on, and entities can either be internal or external. So OWASP being in the top 10, it currently sits at position number 4. It was put in there in 2017, just out of nowhere. So prior to 2017, it wasn't actually in the OWASP top 10 at all, which was interesting considering this has been an issue for servers and healthcare providers and financial institutes and things like that. It looks a bit like this. It might look kind of similar to HTML if you're into that kind of thing, which I won't go down that way. But yeah, so you might log into a web application and it would send an XML request kind of like this. So you'd have a login, and then inside that login request, you'd have your username and your password fields. XML documents are made up of 2 sections. So you have a piece at the top called a document type definition, and then below that you'll have all the data that actually makes up the document. So the document type definition has all of the building blocks and sets a whole lot of constraints for what can be inside the document, and then the actual data itself must comply with those constraints, but can reference entities and things that are defined in your DTD. Cool. So this is kind of what it looks like. So that green piece at the top would be your DTD. So you'll have an element at the top there which says that all of the books within this document must have a title, an author, and a blurb. And then there's an internal entity called default blurb that says no blurb has been entered for this book yet. So if you had 1,000 books that you hadn't entered blurbs for, rather than having that long string repeated 1,000 times, you could just reference it back to this one piece at the top. And then if you ever needed to change it, you could change it in that one place rather than changing it in 1,000 places. So internal entities like the one we just talked about have the data or the definition of the entity stored inside the document type definition. This allows them to easily be referenced repeatedly, just like we just talked about. So exactly like that. So the bit in the blue is then referenced down below. Cool. So you can abuse this to do some really fun things. This one is referred to as a billion laughs attack. So what happens is you define an internal entity that just says lol, and then you define another internal entity that references the original internal entity. and it references it, in this case, 10 times, and then we define another one that references that second one 10 times, and that expands and expands out to be massive. In this case, because we have it done, was that 10 to the 9, you end up with 1 billion instances of lol, which is, yeah, hence the name. So obviously that's going to generate like a massive amount of data and cause some issues for your server. It's going to consume all of the memory that you have available, and your application is going to crash. So yeah, your tiny payload that looks like this ends up being so big that it crashes your application, which gives you great free high severity findings, and the client is very happy. The other side of this is external entities. So where we've just talked about internal entities, where the data is stored inside the DTD, we can also have data that's stored outside the DTD. So we're referencing that data so that when it gets parsed, the parser will go and collect that data and incorporate it into our XML document. You can use this to do some interesting things like reading files off the local server. That could be for a genuine reason. So perhaps you need to reference an image or something that's somebody's profile picture or something like that, in which case you should only be able to access those profile pictures within the server. But in this case, if it's not constrained properly, you could use that to access lots of other interesting information like everyone's password. You could also use it to access other files that the server might have access to that you do not have access to. So if the server that you can access is sitting in a DMZ somewhere, but then has access to a whole bunch of other applications internally, you could use it to perform server-side request forgery to access all of those. In a similar vein, you could use it to do network recon to try and find those things if you don't know that they're there to start with. Or like we just talked about earlier, remote code execution if you have just the right situation, which we'll have a look at. So you might want to know, how do you go about identifying the fact that you can access these external entities? If the data isn't being returned, then you can perform a time-based attack so that you know that if this request takes forever to respond or just doesn't respond at all, whereas all of the normal requests respond instantly, then you've probably got an instance where this is working out for you. So in this one here, we're making an external entity reference to the dev random file, which just goes on forever, so this request is never going to return. So what happens is the application will try and process your login request. It'll go, okay, I have to go grab this username, and then when it tries to grab the username from the dev random file, that just goes on forever and never returns. Which, yeah, everyone loves a demo, right? So yeah, fingers crossed this works. So I've got a vulnerable, is that showing for you guys? Yeah. Okay. Just a vulnerable web application running. You can download this yourself. I've only done some very minor modifications to it. It's up on GitHub under XXE-study from HL Overflow, I think it is. This is Burp Suite. This is a tool that we use for penetration testing quite a lot for web applications and things like that. It just lets you intercept the traffic and replay requests and modify all the data and things like that. So in this case here, we're going to set our DTD to reference dev random, like we just talked about before, and that's going to be the password or the username, and then it's going to be our username, and then the password just doesn't really matter at that point. So we send that, and it just never responds. Which, if we compare that to, we send a normal request, and it says, sorry, the test user is not available. So that responds instantly, whereas when we try to access the dev random file, it just never responds. If we were to try and access a file that just doesn't exist, you'll see that it does respond straight away. Cool. So yeah, doesn't respond. Cool. Well, here's the screenshot in case the demo didn't work. So other things that we can do now that we've shown that we can access external entities is we could start looking for interesting files. So there's files like XXE password that in Linux hosts or like contains a list of all your users for the system. So we're doing exactly the same thing again. We're going to send a login request. As the username, we're going to put, please give me the XXE password file. And yeah, again, the password just doesn't matter. So demo time. So yeah, there we go. Shadow, please. Password, yep, it should just say password, please. In this case, I don't have the web application running as root, so we can't access the shadow file, which would be the file that does contain all of the passwords. If you were to find an application that was running as root, then yeah, you're in the money there, and you can go and get everyone's passwords and start cracking them, which would be great. So you can see a list of all of the users that would be on the underlying host to the web application. Here's, yeah, again, another screenshot in case it didn't work. So some of the interesting files that you might want to go and look at if you were to find this to occur would be anything that's application specific. So if you were to go and steal database creds for the application or anything like that, go and read the source code for the application. If the application calls out to external services, so anything that's hosted in S3 or anything like that, or if you're using any other external services, go and steal those tokens. That tends to be pretty high value. If you're doing this for bug bounty hunting, that tends to be like pretty good payout. You could just, yeah, generally read the application source code, so you could go and hunt for other vulnerabilities. Or you could just start reading the operating system files. So things like XXE password, XXE shadow. You could start looking at bash histories of the users of the application, or any SSH keys if you're running as a specific user. So we have used this in the past to pull out bash histories, which has given us some great results where we found that an application was set up with a specific admin user and password, which then, despite the fact we'd already gone down and accessed the underlying server, the client was much more worried about the fact that we now have full control over the application above as an admin user rather than just accessing the underlying host. Right, yeah, so remote code execution. I guess this is the one that everyone loves to see. In this case, to get remote code execution using XXE, you need some very specific preconditions to be met. The one that I'm going to show you today is an application running in PHP, and it has the PHP expect module installed, which lets you execute some commands. You can sort of see that there, where we're just doing exactly the same thing again. We're going to pull an external entity reference to expect and then our command, so in that case, ID. Before we get into that, some background information. When you exploit the expect function, there's lots of stuff that you can't do, like lots of characters that you're not allowed to use that massively restrict your ability to run commands. The most noticeable of those being that you can't use the space character, which, if anyone's familiar with typing commands into a command line, like almost all of them have spaces in them, which is super painful. However, the $ifs for internal field separator in your shell can be used as a replacement for space in this case. There's a lot of other special characters, so things like angle brackets and ampersands and some things like that that you can't replace with those special characters as far as I'm aware. So in order to get this to actually work properly, we're going to do a two-step process where we spin up a web server on our attacker, host a PHP file with a backdoor shell, get the victim server to pull that PHP file and store it locally. Then we're going to use that backdoor to get a proper shell to call back to our attacker. So fingers crossed this all works. So yeah, still the same web application running there. And we have another shell down the bottom. I don't know how well, if that's going to read particularly well. There we go. So just spin up a simple Python web server to host our application, to host our file that we're going to pull later on. We'll set up a listener to catch the shell when we finally get there. Actually, yeah, I'll show you this first. So this is kind of boring just to prove that it works. So we've run the ID command, and it's shown us that we're running as www.data, and that's our group and our group ID. You could replace anything else in there that doesn't include spaces or other banned characters, so just ls. We'll print all the files that are currently sitting in the web directory. So what we're going to do here is we're going to run the curl command with our special spaces thrown in. We're going to call to our attacker server that's hosting the backdoor.php file, and we're going to download that and leave it in our web directory. So we run that. Yeah, you can see that backdoor is sitting in there. And now we're going to access that backdoor with this URL encoded payload. That's just a simple Python shell that calls back to our attacker on port 999, which if we look here was the one that we were listening on. And we can see that the request came through to pull the backdoor shell off the web server. So we do part 2, and that doesn't return because it's stuck hosting our shell, which is good news. So if that did return, I'd be a bit worried. And we've got the $sign, so we're in the money. So who am I? Oh, that didn't even work. Oh. Yeah, so we're running as www.data. We can see all of the underlying files and things. And we can cat out the flag, and we've got the, got your critical finding. Cool. So yeah, here's a screenshot showing that it kind of works in case it didn't work. But yeah, so what happens when you get remote code execution, that's basically it, you win. You're in for a good time. Client's either going to be very happy or very sad, depending on which side of the table they sit on. Yeah, but in reality, what happens when you get remote code execution, you can do what we just did and get a shell. You can, further access all of the source code. You can then use the box to go and pivot off to other things. So this might sound kind of similar to what we talked about before that you could already do with XXE. But all of those things tend to have restrictions about not being able to do it active, and you don't have a history and things like that. Whereas in this case, you now have like a proper interactive shell, and you can go and like jump from here to somewhere else to somewhere else to somewhere else and get like full ownership of everything, which is great. I don't know, if you're a bad guy, you could, go and deploy a Bitcoin miner or ransomware the box and, make some sweet cash. If you're a developer, you probably want to know how to prevent this kind of thing. Here's a list of things that you can go and do to stop some bad guy doing all of this to you. For the most part, most modern parsers don't allow you to do these things by default anyway. You tend to have to go and turn on a bunch of functionality that, like, for lack of a better word, like actually breaks the parser to allow these things to happen. As a part of this, I did want to do a demo for the denial of service billion last attack that we talked about earlier. So one example of that is that that's been patched out in libxml a long time ago. So I'd have to go and dig out an old version of that library in order to actually get that demo to work. However, that's not to say that it doesn't happen. So we have found applications within the last 12 months that were still vulnerable to that, even though it was patched out like years ago. If you're interested in looking at some more stuff in XXE, here's some links. So that's the GitHub that I was using the application from at the top. So I only made some very minor changes that would not really be relevant to get these demos to work for today. There's an OWASP link that covers what XXE is and a prevention cheat sheet if you're a developer to stop yourself becoming a victim to this. As a summary, what we talked about, we've learned what XML is, what XXE is, what internal entities are, what external entities are, and hopefully how to do a bit of prevention. Thank you for listening.